Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy History Secrets, a quiet corner where the past drifts in softly and forgotten worlds return as gentle stories for the night. Tonight, we'll be wandering into medieval things that were once free until someone slowly began charging everyone for them, and how those small changes reshaped villages, cities, armies, and even imperial courts across distant lands, letting old times unfold at a pace meant for rest. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's slowly step into the past, softly, gently, together. Tonight you begin in a village where almost everything you need still feels close to your hands. The oven is shared, the forest is nearby, the river bends quietly through familiar grass. No one has yet explained that these ordinary things will soon belong to someone else. And the first change arrives not with soldiers, not with banners, but with bread. You wake before the light has fully reached the edge of the fields, because baking is never done late in the day. The dough is already waiting. It rests in a shallow wooden bowl beside the doorway, covered with a cloth that smells faintly of yesterday's flour and smoke. The surface has risen overnight, quiet and patient, as though it understood that morning would bring work again. You lift the bowl carefully, holding it close so the cool air does not trouble it. Once, not very long ago, you could bake where you wished. A small clay oven behind the house was enough. A shared fire between neighbors worked just as well. Sometimes 3 families gathered together and baked in turn, passing loaves from hand to hand while children waited nearby, watching the crust darken slowly. Bread belonged to everyone then, in the same way that sunrise belonged to everyone. But now the village oven stands in a different place. It stands closer to the Lord's Hall than to your own doorway. You walk there with others already moving along the narrow path, each carrying dough wrapped in cloth, baskets balanced on hips, wooden boards pressed under arms. No one speaks very loudly. Morning baking has become a careful business, and careful things are usually quiet things. The oven itself is larger than the old ones used to be. Its stone mouth opens like a patient animal waiting to be fed. And beside it stands a man whose job is not to bake. His job is to watch. He keeps a narrow board tucked beneath one arm, and from time to time, he makes small marks on it with a piece of charcoal. The marks are not for counting loaves, they are for counting people. Because the oven is no longer simply an oven, it is now something that belongs to the Lord. Across much of medieval Europe, this change happened slowly enough that no single morning felt different from the last. A rule appeared first as a suggestion, then as a habit, and finally as an obligation. Villagers were expected to bring their dough to the Lord's oven instead of baking at home, and in return, they paid a small portion of their bread or grain for the privilege. The payment was rarely large. That was not the point. The point was that the oven gathered everyone into one place, at one time, under one rule. A loaf placed inside its warm stone chamber was no longer just food. It had become something like a quiet agreement. You step forward when your turn comes. The watcher lifts the cloth from your bowl and inspects the dough without touching it, as though looking alone were enough to measure its worth. Then he nods, and the baker slides your loaf into the glowing chamber beside many others already swelling in the heat. Inside, they rise together. Outside, you wait. Waiting becomes part of baking now. Waiting beside neighbors who are also learning how patience can be shaped into obedience without anyone ever saying the word aloud. In parts of France and England, records from manor courts quietly describe these ovens as necessary facilities belonging to the lord of the estate. Villagers were not forbidden to eat bread, of course. They were simply expected to cook it in the correct place. And if someone tried to bake elsewhere, the punishment was usually not dramatic. It was administrative. A fine. A warning. Occasionally, the careful dismantling of a private oven behind someone's house, which is a surprisingly effective way to remind a village that even warmth can belong to someone else. A woman ahead of you shifts her basket from one arm to the other. She is the miller's wife, and she's been awake longer than anyone else in the line. Her sleeves are dusted with flour up to the elbows, and she keeps glancing toward the oven door as though she can hear the crust forming inside. She does not complain. Complaints are loud things, and loud things travel quickly. Instead, She waits with the calm expression of someone who already knows that tomorrow she will return here again, and the morning after that as well. Like when the baker finally lifts her loaf from the fire, she smiles very slightly, the way people smile when something familiar has happened exactly as expected. It is not a large change. It is only a loaf of bread. And yet the village has already begun to rearrange itself around it, the way dough slowly reshapes itself around warmth. Soon, another change will follow just as quietly. Because if bread must be baked in the Lord's oven, then grain must also be ground somewhere very particular before it ever reaches your hands. The path to the mill is longer than the path to the oven. You notice this immediately, though no one mentions it aloud. Bread begins with grain, and grain must first be broken open, its quiet hardness turned into something softer and pale and useful. Once, this work happened close to home. A small handstone rested near the doorway, or beside the hearth, or sometimes tucked beneath a wooden bench where children were warned not to disturb it. It moved slowly in circles, guided by patient hands that knew the rhythm without thinking. Grinding was never hurried work. It belonged to evenings, to conversations, to the low crackle of firewood and the faint sound of neighbors passing outside. But now the handstone is missing. Not gone entirely, perhaps, just no longer visible where it used to be. You carry your grain in a sack that presses against your shoulder as you walk toward the Lord's mill, which stands near the bend in the stream where water moves fastest. The wheel turns even before you reach it, speaking in a steady wooden language that can be heard from far across the fields. It is a strong sound, a confident sound, and lately it has become the only sound that grain is supposed to make. Across much of medieval Europe, lords gradually required villagers to grind their harvest at the estate mill instead of at home. The rule did not arrive suddenly. Like the oven before it, the change settled into daily life one instruction at a time. Grinding at home became discouraged. Then it became unusual. Then it became forbidden in quiet, practical ways. A mill, after all, is easier to count than a kitchen. You step inside and place your sack beside others, already waiting their turn. The miller lifts each bundle carefully, weighing it in his hands with the calm experience of someone who understands grain not only as food, but as measurement. A portion will remain here when the grinding is done. That portion belongs to the Lord. The amount is small enough to feel reasonable. It is large enough to matter. People call it the milling share. Sometimes it is taken as flour, sometimes as grain, sometimes as both. The exact portion changes from place to place, but the habit remains the same everywhere. Grain enters the mill as something personal. It leaves the mill as something counted. Near the doorway stands another figure who is not here to grind anything at all. He watches, not constantly, not suspiciously, just carefully enough to notice what should not be there. From time to time, he walks along the outer wall of the building and taps the wooden planks with a narrow stick. The sound echoes lightly across the yard. It is not a warning sound. It is a listening sound. He is checking for hidden stones. In several medieval estate courts, our records describe small household grinding stones being removed from cottages after rules changed. The stones themselves were not dangerous. They were simply inconvenient to the system that had begun to grow around the mill. A village where everyone grinds grain in one place is easier to understand than a village where flour appears from many doorways without explanation. So inspectors walked. They did not hurry. They tapped walls and lifted baskets and sometimes asked polite questions whose answers were already known. If they found a stone, they did not usually shout. They carried it away. You notice the inspector pause beside a low storage bench near the mill entrance. He bends slightly, then taps once against the wood. The sound is dull. He taps again. This time it rings differently. A moment later he kneels and reaches underneath. When he stands again, he is holding a small circular cornstone, smooth from long use, pale with flour dust that no one had time to wash away. No one says anything. The owner of the stone looks at the ground, not at the inspector, not at the stone, not at anyone else. The inspector turns the stone slowly in his hands, as though examining a familiar tool that has simply appeared in the wrong place. Then, he carries it away. It is a quiet moment, quiet enough that the mill wheel continues turning without interruption. In documents preserved from estates across England after the Norman conquest, mills appear again and again as some of the most valuable features of a lord's land. They are listed beside fields and pastures and orchards, not because they produce grain, but because they organize how grain becomes food. The mill gathers harvest from many households and passes it through one narrow doorway of permission. Standing there beside the turning wheel, you begin to understand something new about the village. The oven brought people together. The mill brings their harvest together. And anything that gathers people or harvest in one place can also gather obligations without ever needing to speak about them directly. The miller hands back your flour at last. It is warm from the stones, lighter than it was before, and already ready for baking. You thank him quietly, though you are not entirely certain whether the thanks are meant for him, for the wheel, or for the system that now stands between you and your own grain. As you step outside, you notice the inspector again. He's walking slowly toward the cottages at the edge of the village, tapping his stick lightly against door frames as he passes, listening not for noise but for independence. And somewhere beyond those cottages, the forest waits in silence, already preparing to become something different from what it once was. The forest begins where the path becomes uncertain. It does not announce itself with gates or markers. It simply grows thicker, quieter, and older with each step you take away from the fields. The air changes first, then the light changes. Soon even sound begins to move differently, settling into the leaves instead of crossing the open ground the way it does near the village. For as long as anyone remembers, this forest has been part of daily life. You come here for fallen branches after storms. You gather dry sticks for cooking fires. In winter, when the wind is sharp and the days are short, the forest becomes something even more important than shelter. It becomes warmth waiting to be carried home. No one owns fallen wood, people used to say. Fallen wood belongs to whoever bends down first. That idea feels simple enough to be permanent. But like the oven and like the mill, the forest has begun to change without moving at all. The first sign is not a fence, it is a warning. Someone mentions that cutting young branches is no longer allowed. Another person says that snares for rabbits should not be left overnight. A third explains that deer have always belonged to the Lord, though perhaps not everyone understood that before. The rules arrive gently, the way mist arrives in the morning. They do not push, they settle. After the Norman conquest of England, kings began declaring large areas of woodland as royal forest. The word forest did not mean simply a place full of trees. It meant land placed under a special kind of law, one that protected animals, timber, and sometimes even streams for the use of the crown. Inside these forests, ordinary habits changed their meaning. Hunting became trespass, cutting branches became damage, walking with certain tools became suspicion. The trees themselves did not change, but the way people moved among them did. You step carefully over a fallen trunk and look for branches already dry enough to carry. The best ones are never far from the path, though today you notice fewer than usual. Someone else has already been here earlier in the morning. That's not surprising. People come earlier now. Earlier means safer. Earlier means less visible. In forest courts established across England and parts of northern France, small offenses were recorded with surprising patience. A broken branch, a snare set in the wrong place, a cart loaded with wood that appeared too heavy to be accidental. These were not treated as dramatic crimes. They were treated as quiet corrections, a reminder that the forest was no longer only a place, it had become a boundary. You kneel to gather a handful of thin sticks and tie them together with a strip of cloth. They are not large enough to attract attention, not heavy enough to look deliberate, just enough for a cooking fire that will not last very long. Somewhere deeper among the trees, you hear another movement. It is not an animal, it is smaller than that. A child steps carefully between the trunks, holding a bundle of twigs hidden beneath a loose cloak. The sticks are too long to conceal completely, and their ends trail softly against the ground as the child walks. Every few steps, the child pauses and listens, not because the forest is dangerous, but because the forest is now watched. No one taught the child to move this way. The forest itself did. Royal forest law did not forbid people from entering woodland altogether. That would have been impossible. Villages depended too deeply on nearby trees. Instead, the law adjusted how people entered, how long they stayed, and what they carried when they left. Even fallen branches sometimes required permission. Even small fires could begin with uncertainty. In records from medieval forest courts, the difference between cutting a living branch and collecting one already fallen could determine whether a person owed a fine. And the distinction sounds delicate, almost gentle, but it shaped daily choices in ways that lasted generations. A branch lying on the ground was no longer simply wood. It was evidence waiting to be interpreted. You stand again and lift your bundle. The forest still smells the same as it always has: damp leaves, bark, moss, the faint sweetness of distant sap. Nothing about the trees suggests ownership. Nothing about the birds suggests boundaries. And yet each step toward the village feels slightly different from the last time you walked this path, because now you carry not only wood, you carry awareness. In some royal forests, special officers walk the boundaries regularly, not to frighten villagers, but to remind them that the forest existed inside a larger order. These officers listened for axes, watched for traps, and noticed carts moving at unusual hours. Their presence was rarely dramatic. It was steady instead. Steady things are often the most effective. As you reach the edge of the trees, the child with the hidden sticks passes quietly ahead of you, moving faster now that the open fields are close. No one stops the child. No one speaks. The moment disappears into ordinary morning activity as though it had never happened. But something else has changed again. The forest is still standing behind you. Only now it stands slightly farther away than it did before. And beyond the fields, where the river bends around the village road, another kind of boundary is already waiting, one that does not grow from trees at all, but from water that has begun to remember who is allowed to cross it. Bro. The river never looked like something that could belong to anyone. It bends where the land asks it to bend. It widens when the banks soften. It narrows again between stones that have stood longer than memory. Water does not stay still long enough to be owned, or so people once believed, because it moves even when no one is watching. For a long time, the river felt like a companion rather than a boundary. You crossed it when needed. You fished where the reeds opened into quiet pools. Children stepped barefoot into its shallow edges in summer afternoons, lifting smooth stones from the current and dropping them again just to hear the sound. The river did not ask questions then. But now something has changed, though the water itself looks exactly the same. You notice the change first where the path meets the bank. There is a narrow wooden platform that was not here before. It rests just above the mudline, supported by short posts hammered into the ground. A rope stretches across the water to the opposite side, tied to a leaning pole that marks the crossing place more clearly than any path ever did. And beside the rope stands a man who is not crossing the river. He is waiting. A ferryman used to be someone who helped when help was needed. Now he is someone who keeps track of who passes. His boat is small but steady, worn smooth along its edges by years of quiet travel across the same stretch of water. He gestures for you to step inside, not urgently, but with the confidence of someone whose presence has become expected. You reach into your pouch before he speaks. That, too, has become expected. Across medieval Europe, rivers slowly changed from shared spaces into counted crossings. Lords received charters granting control over bridges, ferries, and fisheries, and these rights allowed them to collect small payments from those who passed or worked along the water. The payments were rarely large. Like the oven and the mill before them, they were simply regular. Regular things shape habits more quickly than dramatic ones. You settle onto the narrow bench inside the boat as the ferryman unties the rope and pushes away from the bank with a long pole. The current moves beneath you in a slow, patient rhythm that feels older than the village itself. He says very little. Instead, he reaches into a small wooden box beside his seat and places your coin inside without counting it aloud. He already knows its weight. In estate records from England after the Norman conquest, Fisheries appear beside mills and fields as valuable parts of a lord's income. Control over a stretch of river often included not only fish, but also reeds, banks, and even the right to decide where nets could be cast. A fisherman standing in the wrong place was not simply unlucky, he was visible, and visibility was becoming important. You remember when fishing meant standing quietly wherever the water felt promising. Now certain pools are avoided, not because the fish have disappeared, but because the permission has. The ferryman guides the boat toward the opposite bank and steadies it with his pole before you step onto the wooden landing. Behind you, another traveler is already waiting to cross. The ferryman nods once, the way people nod when their work continues without interruption. His job is not to hurry anyone. His job is to notice everyone. Further upstream, where the river narrows between two rocky slopes, a bridge has recently appeared. It is not large. It does not need to be. Even a small bridge gathers movement the way a shallow valley gathers rain. Once travelers crossed wherever the banks allowed it. Now most of them cross where the bridge stands, because bridges make journeys easier, and easier journeys are easier to count. Many medieval toll bridges were built not only to improve travel, but also to guide it. A narrow crossing encourages people to choose the same path again and again, until that path becomes the only path that feels natural. Over time, the coin given at the bridge begins to feel as ordinary as the step taken onto its wooden planks. You walk across slowly. Halfway over, you pause for a moment and look down at the current sliding beneath the boards. Nothing in the water suggests ownership. The surface reflects the same sky it always has. Yet the bridge above it has changed how people move across the valley. Sometimes control begins with direction rather than force. On the far side of the bridge stands a small shelter where another man keeps watch. He is not a guard in the way soldiers are guards. He does not carry weapons. He carries a ledger instead, and from time to time he opens it carefully, as though it were something fragile that might tear if handled too quickly. Inside the ledger are marks that represent journeys. And journeys have become something that can be written down. In some places, toll rights extended even beyond bridges themselves. A lord might claim payment from travelers who passed along roads visible from his tower, whether or not the road had been improved at all. Visibility alone could become a boundary, just as surely as stone or wood. You leave the bridge behind and follow the road toward the village fields again. Behind you, the ferryman's boat continues its quiet crossing, back and forth, like a steady breath moving across the surface of the river. The water still flows freely, but the ways across it no longer do. And somewhere ahead, beyond the hedges where livestock graze slowly in the afternoon light, another change is already waiting, one that will follow you even when you are not traveling anywhere at all, here because it concerns the road beneath your own feet. The road always seemed like the simplest thing in the world. It did not belong to anyone. It was only a line pressed into the earth by footsteps repeated so often that the ground remembered them. Hooves followed it, wheels deepened it, rain softened it, and sun hardened it again. A road was never built in one moment. It was built slowly, by habit. That is why its change feels so surprising. You notice it first, not by what appears on the road, but by what appears beside it. A narrow wooden frame stands where the path narrows between two hedges. It is not tall enough to be called a gate, yet not small enough to ignore. A rope stretches loosely across the track, tied at one end to a post that leans slightly toward the ditch. Nearby, a man sits on a stool with a small box resting across his knees. He does not block the road, he simply waits beside it. People slow down when they reach him, not because they must, but because everyone else has already slowed down before them. Habits spread quietly along roads. Soon they become expectations. You reach into your pouch again. Coins move more often now than they once did. Across much of medieval Europe, toll rights were granted to local lords, monasteries, or towns as part of their authority over nearby land. These tolls did not always follow the building of new roads. Sometimes they followed only the recognition that a road already existed. A path could remain exactly as it was and still begin to cost something. You step past the rope once the coin has changed hands. The man nods without looking directly at you, as though the exchange itself were more important than the people involved in it. Behind you, another traveler approaches with two sheep tied loosely together by a thin cord. The man with the box lifts his head slightly this time. Livestock crossings are counted differently. The traveler pauses, unties the cord, reties it more carefully, and produces another coin before continuing forward. The sheep move quietly, their hooves making a soft tapping sound against the packed earth of the road. Sound travels differently along roads than it does across fields. It gathers beneath wheels. It settles beneath steps. It lingers between hedges where voices pass slowly from one traveler to another. Over time, the small pause beside the rope becomes part of the sound of the road itself. Not every toll stood across the path so plainly. In some regions, rights were claimed over roads simply because they could be seen from a nearby tower. If a road passed within sight of a fortified house or estate boundary, the lord might collect a payment from travelers moving through that visible space. The road itself remained unchanged. Only its meaning shifted. Visibility became a kind of ownership. You walk a little farther and notice where the path divides into two smaller tracks. One continues forward between open fields. The other turns slightly toward a low stretch of marshland where the ground looks softer and less certain beneath your feet. A merchant stands there beside a cart loaded with sacks tied carefully under canvas. He studies the two routes for a long moment, then he turns toward the marsh. The decision is not dramatic. He does not hurry. He simply guides the cart slowly away from the toll post behind him and toward the quieter path where the wheels sink slightly deeper into the soil with each turn. Avoiding a toll often meant choosing a harder road rather than refusing the journey altogether. In many medieval regions, travelers created alternative tracks through fields, wetlands, and wooded edges to pass around official crossings. Over time, these detours became known routes of their own, shaped not by convenience, but by calculation. Even silence could become a direction. You continue along the main road, where the surface remains firm and familiar beneath your steps. A wagon passes beside you carrying bundles of hay stacked higher than the driver's shoulders. He lifts one hand in greeting, but does not slow. Perhaps he has already paid his toll earlier in the morning. Perhaps he will pay another before the day is finished. The road does not explain itself. It only continues. Records preserved in medieval charters sometimes describe toll rights extending over bridges that had not yet been repaired, paths that had not yet been widened, or crossings that had existed long before any authority claimed them. The payment was not always connected to improvement. Often it was connected to recognition. Once a road was recognized, it could be counted. Once it was counted, it could be owned in a certain quiet way. You reach a small rise where the road curves gently toward the village again. From here, you can see smoke rising from several chimneys at once, thin gray lines lifting slowly into the afternoon air. Somewhere near those chimneys, people are preparing evening meals, repairing tools, and speaking about tomorrow's work as though tomorrow will resemble today. And in many ways, it will. But something else has changed again, something that follows you even when you are not walking, even when you are not crossing rivers or forests or bridges at all. Because soon you will discover that even choosing who to marry can require permission from someone who never walks beside you on the road. By the time the sun begins to lower toward the hedges, most of the day's work has already settled into memory. Tools are cleaned, animals are counted, fires are prepared for the evening meal. The village grows quieter in a different way than it does at night, not because people are sleeping, but because they are finishing things. This is often the hour when important conversations happen. You walk along the narrow track between two cottages, where the air smells faintly of brewing grain and damp straw. A small group has gathered near the doorway of the steward's house. No one is speaking loudly. Even laughter, if it appears, arrives gently and disappears quickly. Two people stand slightly apart from the others. They are young enough that their hands still move when they talk, not yet accustomed to keeping still during serious moments. They stand close together, though not close enough to touch. Between them stands the steward, holding a narrow strip of parchment folded twice along its length. It is not a large document, but it changes things. In many medieval villages across England and parts of France, marriage was not only a personal promise, it was also a moment recorded within the structure of the estate. When a tenant's daughter married, especially if she left the manor to join another household, A payment was often expected. This payment was known in several regions by a word that simply meant a marriage due. The amount varied from place to place, the habit did not. The steward unfolds the parchment slowly, reading in a voice so calm that it almost sounds like ordinary conversation. He is not preventing the marriage, he's not even delaying it. He is simply making sure that the marriage fits into the order that already surrounds the village. A coin changes hands. The couple nod, and something that once belonged entirely to them now belongs partly to the record. Marriage payments were sometimes explained as compensation for the loss of labor when a daughter moved to another household. Sometimes they were described as customary recognition of the Lord's authority over tenancy. The explanation mattered less than the pattern. Private moments were beginning to leave small footprints inside public systems. The couple step away together once the parchment has been folded again. Their conversation returns to its earlier rhythm, quieter now, but still hopeful. Nothing about the sky above them has changed. The evening light still settles across the fields the way it always has. Yet something invisible has shifted slightly beneath their feet. You continue walking toward the edge of the village where a cluster of wooden barrels rests beneath a low shelter. The smell here is stronger than near the steward's house. It carries the warmth of fermenting grain and the faint sweetness of yeast rising slowly through damp air. Brewing once happened wherever grain and water met patience. In many villages, households prepared small amounts of ale for daily use without needing permission from anyone at all. But over time, brewing began to gather rules around it, just as baking and milling had done earlier. In some places, selling ale required approval. In others, even preparing larger quantities invited attention from estate officers who ensured that measures were fair and payments properly recorded. Ale did not stop being ale, it simply began to belong to someone else as well. Nearby, a narrow pasture stretches along the edge of a shallow stream where cattle graze slowly with their heads lowered toward the grass. The animals move where the grass is thickest, not where boundaries are written. Yet grazing rights, like brewing rights, these slowly became tied to the structure of the estate. Some meadows were shared only at certain times of year. Some fields required agreement before animals could enter them. Some paths between pastures narrowed until they passed through gates that did not exist before. A meadow can remain green and open while still becoming organized. Even rainwater began to take on new meanings in enclosed landscapes, where fields were divided carefully and drainage channels guided water away from certain areas and toward others. The simple act of collecting runoff from a roof or guiding it across a boundary could become part of a larger conversation about use and permission. Water still fell from the sky freely, but the way it moved across the ground began to follow decisions made elsewhere. You pause beside the pasture fence and watch the cattle move slowly across the grass as evening approaches. Their shadows lengthen quietly behind them, stretching toward the hedges where the first stars will soon appear. Stars never ask permission to rise. They appear one at a time, in the same patient order each night, reminding anyone who looks upward that some patterns belong to no steward and no ledger at all. Yet here on the ground, patterns have begun to change. Bread now passes through the oven, grain now passes through the mill, wood now passes through the forest court, water now passes through the ferry, roads now pass through toll ropes, and even promises between two people can pass briefly through the hands of someone holding parchment at a doorway. As evening deepens and the village settles into its familiar quiet, it becomes easier to notice something else as well. These changes did not arrive all at once. They arrived one permission at a time. Far beyond this village, in another province where stone roads run straighter and camps rise more quickly beside them, a different kind of authority is already shaping daily life in its own steady way, not through ovens or forests, but through soldiers who know how to stay long after a war is ended. The road you walk now is straighter than the village paths you remember. It does not bend around hedges or soften at the edges of fields. Instead, it stretches forward with a quiet certainty that feels deliberate, as though someone once decided exactly where it should go and then asked the land to agree. This is the kind of road soldiers prefer. It carries weight evenly. It allows movement in all seasons. It turns distance into something measurable rather than guessed. And along this road, long before sunrise, a column of men is already moving. They walk in silence, not because silence is required, but because silence makes distance easier to cross. Among them is a young legionary whose pack rests heavily across both shoulders. He pauses briefly at the edge of a clearing where wooden stakes have been laid in careful rows upon the ground. One by one, the soldiers lift these stakes and begin pressing them into the soil, forming a narrow wall that did not exist there the day before. By evening, it will become a camp. The Roman army carried its camps with it wherever it traveled. Each evening, after marching, the soldiers arranged their tents in precise lines within a square boundary marked by trenches and sharpened posts. The shape appeared again and again across provinces separated by mountains, rivers, and languages. Wherever the camp appeared, Rome appeared with it. This particular column belongs to the 10th Legion Fretensis, a unit whose history stretches back to the campaigns of Julius Caesar more than a century earlier. In those earlier days, the legion marched through lands far to the west, learning how to build bridges across fast rivers and walls across open plains. Over time, its reputation grew not only from battle, but from construction. Some legions fought, this one built. Its symbol was the wild boar, an animal known for persistence rather than speed. The emblem appeared on shields and standards carried at the center of the marching column, where it moved steadily forward with the same confidence as the road beneath their feet. Symbols mattered in a legion. They reminded soldiers that they belonged to something older than themselves. As the column approaches the edge of Judea, the landscape begins to change. Hills rise more sharply, paths narrow into stone-lined tracks between terraces where farmers work quietly among olive trees. Villages appear briefly and then disappear again behind low ridges of earth that hold the heat of the day long after sunset. The legion continues forward without pausing. Roman movement through a province was rarely sudden. It arrived step by step, camp by camp, road by road. Each evening, camp created a small square of order within unfamiliar terrain. Each morning, departure left behind the memory of that square, like a stone placed carefully within a larger pattern. The young legionary tightens the strap beneath his shoulder and looks toward the center of the clearing where officers are already marking the outline of the camp's main street. Every camp contained the same streets, the same central space, the same arrangement of tents and tools. Even far from Rome, the shape of the city traveled with the army. It was possible to wake in a different province and still know exactly where to walk before breakfast. That familiarity made long campaigns easier to endure. It also made long occupations easier to maintain. In the years that followed the great uprising in Judea during the 1st century after the birth of Christ, the 10th Legion remained in the region rather than returning west. Its presence became part of the province itself. Camps hardened into fortresses. Roads connected those fortresses to towns where supplies could be counted more easily than before. Grain moved differently once soldiers stood beside the road that carried it. You walk now along one of those roads, noticing how its surface holds together even after many seasons of weather. Stones lie fitted against one another so closely that the wheels of carts pass without sinking into mud. Movement becomes predictable on such a surface. Predictable movement becomes visible movement, and visible movement can be recorded. Roman roads did not simply shorten journeys, they gathered journeys together. Travelers chose them because they were easier. Merchants chose them because they were safer. Officials chose them because they connected one camp to another in ways that could be followed without uncertainty. A road that connects camps also connects authority. The young legionary finishes securing the last strap across his pack and steps back from the line of stakes now forming the outer wall of the camp. Around him, other soldiers continue working without speaking, each placing posts into the earth at measured intervals that match distances they have memorized through repetition. By nightfall, the camp will be complete. By morning, it will feel permanent. Yet within a few days, the legion will move again, carrying the shape of its camp forward into another clearing, another hillside, another place where the land will quietly learn the same arrangement of trenches and streets. And soon, beyond these roads and camps, the legion will approach a city whose walls have stood for generations, a city where stone rises higher than any marching camp could reach, and where the presence of soldiers will begin to change not only the road beneath your feet, but the future of the city itself. The road grows quieter as the city comes into view. You notice this first in the way voices carry differently across the hills. Travelers speak less often. Even animals move with more caution, as though the ground itself has begun listening more closely than before. Ahead of you, Jerusalem rises slowly from the stone slopes that surround it, its walls catching the late light in long, pale lines that seem older than the road beneath your feet. Cities like this are not meant to move, they are meant to remain. And yet, unique in the year 70 after the birth of Christ, the 10th Legion Fretensis stood among several Roman legions gathered outside these walls, preparing not simply to approach the city, but to surround it. Roman sieges rarely depended on sudden attacks. Instead, they depended on patience. Soldiers measured distance carefully. They watched gates without rushing toward them. They placed stones where stones were needed, one after another, until the shape of the land itself began to change. You walk along the outer slope where men are already working in long, steady lines. Each soldier lifts a stone. Each soldier passes a stone. Each soldier steps forward. And slowly, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment when it begins to rise above the level of the hillside, a ramp appears. Siege ramps were not dramatic structures at first. They began as small adjustments to the ground, barely visible from a distance. But day after day, stone after stone, they climbed toward the walls, narrowing the space between the city and the army outside it. The work did not stop at sunset. It simply slowed. Flavius Josephus, a historian who witnessed the siege and later wrote about it in careful detail, described how Roman soldiers built not only ramps, but also a continuous line of fortifications around the city. This line prevented movement in or out, turning the surrounding hills into a boundary that followed the city wherever it stood. The boundary did not shout. It settled into place. Standing beside one of the ramps, you see a young stone carrier working near the lower edge of the slope. He does not look toward the walls very often. Instead, he watches the hands in front of him, passing each stone forward at the same pace as the others. The rhythm is steady enough to resemble breathing. Stone moves forward, hands move forward, time moves forward. Roman siege construction relied less on speed than on repetition. Trenches were dug in straight lines that followed measured distances. Timber frames supported the growing ramps. Earth filled the spaces between stones until the slope became strong enough to carry heavier structures upward. Nothing about the work needed to be hurried. Patience could lift mountains if given enough hands. From the walls above, the city watches. Inside Jerusalem, people listen to the same sounds each day. Tools striking stone, carts moving earth, soldiers calling instructions across the hillside. Over time, these sounds became part of the city's weather. As regular as wind moving between towers. Sieges changed landscapes before they changed walls. The ramp beside you continues rising slowly toward one section of the defenses, where Roman engineers have decided the approach will be most effective. Archaeological remains of similar ramps still survive near the city today, their outlines preserved in the shape of the hillside long after the soldiers themselves have disappeared. Stone remembers effort longer than voices remember instructions. As the days pass, the encircling works grow stronger. Josephus described a wall built by the Roman army around the city in a remarkably short time, enclosing Jerusalem within a ring that followed the contours of the surrounding terrain. Such construction required coordination more than force, and lines drawn in earth can be as powerful as lines drawn in battle. You walk along the outer edge of this ring and notice how movement has already begun to change. Paths that once connected nearby villages now end at Roman watchposts. Roads that once led directly to the gates now turn aside or stop altogether. Even the air seems to carry fewer voices beyond the boundary than before. A city can remain standing and still become distant from the world around it. Eventually, after many weeks of work and waiting, Roman forces reached the inner parts of the city. Fighting moved through narrow streets where walls stood close together and shadows fell early in the afternoon. The temple, long at the center of religious and communal life, stood among these final spaces where the struggle narrowed into smaller and smaller places. Josephus later described how the temple complex was destroyed during the final phase of the siege. His account carries both the memory of events and the weight of loss, though historians continue to discuss the exact sequence of decisions that led to the fire. What remains certain is that the destruction changed the city in ways that could not be reversed. Sometimes a building falls, sometimes a center falls with it. Outside the walls, the stone carrier continues his work even after the outcome has begun to take shape. The ramp beneath his feet is already strong enough to support heavier movement now. Where once only small stones passed from hand to hand, larger beams and equipment follow. The hillside itself has learned a new shape. By the time the siege ends, the Roman camps remain where they were first placed. Roads still connect them. Watchposts still stand along the ridges. The army does not disappear when the walls fall. Instead, it stays. And as the seasons change across Judea in the years that follow, the presence of soldiers will begin to settle into the province as quietly as a road settling into the land, until one day it becomes difficult to remember where the camps ended and the countryside began. When the siege ended, the roads did not empty. You might expect soldiers to leave once the walls had fallen and the city had grown quiet again. Armies often arrive quickly and depart just as quickly. But the Roman legions who remained in Judea did something different. They stayed. At first, their presence still looked temporary. Tents stood where tents had stood before. Supply wagons followed familiar routes between camps. Watchposts marked the same ridges they had marked during the siege. Nothing about the arrangement suggested permanence, yet the arrangement did not change. The 10th Legion Fretensis established its base near the ruins of Jerusalem, and over time, the shape of the camp hardened into something closer to a town than a temporary shelter. Trenches became foundations, wooden structures became stone, paths between tents became streets that remained visible even after the tents themselves disappeared. A camp repeated long enough becomes a settlement, and a settlement repeated long enough becomes part of the landscape. You walk along one of the roads that now lead outward from the former camp. The stones are set carefully into the ground, each placed to support the weight of carts moving in both directions throughout the year. Grass grows at the edges, but not in the center. Movement continues here even when no soldiers are visible. Roman roads often outlived the men who built them. They remained because they connected places that had learned to depend on them. After the destruction of Jerusalem, Roman forces did not simply guard the city. They watched the surrounding countryside as well. Roads linked forts positioned across hills and valleys where movement could be observed without interruption. Messengers traveled between these forts carrying information that allowed distant decisions to follow local events more closely than before. Distance became easier to understand, and what can be understood can be governed. Along the roadside stands a small field bordered by low stones arranged in a careful line. Inside the field, a man bends slowly over a young vine, guiding its stem along a thin wooden support. His movements are patient and practiced. Nothing about him suggests hurry. He's no longer a soldier. Years earlier, he carried the same pack as the legionary you saw near the camp clearing. Now, he carries a knife for trimming branches instead. The road beside his field was once part of the camp's outer boundary. Today, it leads travelers past rows of newly planted vines that will take many seasons to grow strong enough to bear fruit. Retired legionaries often received land in the provinces where they had served. Their presence tied distant regions more closely to Roman habits of farming, building, and measurement. Fields were divided carefully. Boundaries were marked clearly. Roads remained straight even where older paths had curved. The land itself began to follow familiar patterns. Inscriptions found across Judea still record the presence of the 10th Legion long after the siege of Jerusalem had ended. These inscriptions appear on stones reused in buildings, on fragments of tools, and sometimes on markers that once stood beside roads leading between settlements. They are quiet reminders that the army's work did not end with the fall of the city. It continued through ordinary days. Several generations later, another uprising began in the hills of Judea, led by a figure remembered as Bar Kokhba. Roman forces responded again, sending additional legions into the region. The conflict that followed reshaped the province once more, leading to new settlements, new fortifications, and new arrangements of land that reflected the continued presence of imperial authority. The roads remained, the camps remained, the watchposts remained. Even when fighting ended, the structure built during those years did not disappear. Instead, it settled into the countryside the way roots settle into soil after a tree has been standing for many seasons. You pause beside the roadside vineyard and watch the retired legionary press the earth gently around the base of a vine. He does not look toward the hills where soldiers once marched. He looks toward the road instead, as though the road itself has become the most reliable sign that the world around him will continue as expected. Nearby, a cart passes carrying sacks of grain toward a settlement further along the route. The driver does not slow when he reaches the straight stretch of stone. He knows where the road leads. He knows who built it. And he knows that grain moving along this road can be counted more easily than grain moving along a narrow path between fields. Roman soldiers did not always collect taxes themselves, but they made taxation possible by ensuring that roads remained open, settlements remained connected, and authority remained visible in places where distance might otherwise have hidden it. A road watched by soldiers becomes a road remembered by officials, and a road remembered by officials becomes part of the system that measures harvest, movement, and time itself. As the sun lowers toward the hills beyond the vineyard, the retired legionary steps back from the vine and rests his hands against the wooden support for a moment before continuing his work. The road beside him stretches forward without bending, linking one settlement to another in a line that feels older than the vines and younger than the hills at the horizon. It is difficult to see where the camp once ended now. The road continues beyond it. And far away, in growing towns across medieval Europe, another kind of road is beginning to form, not built from stone and trenches, but from workshops, tools, and agreements that will decide who is allowed to work and who must wait outside the door until permission is given. The city does not wake the way the village does. In the village, morning arrives slowly, spreading across fields and hedges before anyone begins speaking. In the city, morning begins behind shutters and inside workshops where someone has already opened a door long before the streets fill with footsteps. You step into one of those narrow streets just as the first light reaches the upper windows. The buildings stand close together here. Their wooden beams lean slightly toward one another, as though they have been speaking quietly all night. Somewhere nearby, a hammer touches metal once, then again, and then stops, not because the work is finished, but because the day is only beginning. Inside a workshop near the corner, a boy is already awake. He stands beside a low bench with a cloth wrapped around his wrist, polishing a row of iron tools laid carefully in a straight line across the wood. Each tool reflects a faint line of morning light that moves slowly as he turns them one by one. He does not yet belong to the craft whose tools he holds. He belongs to the years that come before it. In many medieval cities, becoming a craftsman did not begin with choosing a trade. It began with entering a household. Apprentices lived with masters, ate at their tables, and followed their instructions through days that repeated themselves until repetition became understanding. Skill arrived gradually. Permission arrived first. Families often arranged apprenticeships long before a child understood what the chosen trade would require. Agreements were written carefully, sometimes promising that a boy would serve for 7 years, sometimes longer. During that time, he would receive training, clothing, and food. In return, he would offer labor that belonged not to himself, but to the workshop. Workshops were not only places of production, they were places of belonging. The boy lifts another tool and turns it slowly in his hands before placing it beside the others. Outside the doorway, the street begins to fill with movement. Bakers carry baskets, tailors open shutters. A cart rolls past carrying folded cloth stacked higher than the driver's shoulder. Every trade has its own rhythm, but not everyone can enter every rhythm. Guilds across medieval Europe regulated access to crafts with the same quiet consistency that lords once regulated access to ovens and mills. A workshop did not simply accept anyone who wished to learn. Entry followed agreements, introductions, and approvals that ensured the craft remained within a known circle of households. A craft could be learned, but first, it had to be allowed. In London and Florence, apprenticeship contracts recorded the names of both the apprentice and the master, along with the number of years the training would last. These agreements were not temporary promises. They were arrangements that shaped entire childhoods. 7 years is a long time when measured in mornings like this one. The boy finishes polishing the last tool and places the cloth carefully beside the bench. He glances once toward the doorway where the master of the workshop has just appeared, adjusting his sleeves before stepping inside. No instructions are spoken yet. None are needed. The boy already knows where to stand. Apprenticeship did not begin with learning how to shape metal or cut cloth. It began with learning how to move within a space that belonged to someone else. Over time, this movement became familiar enough that the workshop felt less like a place entered each morning and more like a pattern worn comfortably around the day. Like fabric shaped to fit the body slowly, without anyone noticing the moment when it began to feel natural. In many cities, apprentices were expected to remain within the household of their master throughout the training period. They slept near the workshop, they ate with the family. They followed rules that extended beyond tools into behavior, conversation, and even movement through the streets. Learning a craft meant learning a life. Outside, the sound of footsteps grows steadier as merchants begin arranging goods along the street. A cooper rolls a barrel toward the corner. A weaver carries a folded bundle across his shoulder. Each of them passed through years like these before opening their own workshops. None of them began alone. Guild statutes preserved in city archives describe these early years with careful detail. They explain how apprentices should be treated, how masters should supervise them, and how disagreements should be settled if expectations were not met. The rules did not simply protect the craft, they protected its boundaries. Boundaries shape cities as surely as walls do. The boy steps aside as the master lifts a heavier tool from the bench and places it near the doorway where work will begin once the sun rises fully above the rooftops. For now, the workshop remains quiet enough that the sound of cloth brushing against wood feels louder than it should. He watches closely. Watching is part of learning. Years will pass before he's allowed to work independently. Years before his name appears beside the craft, he is only beginning to understand. And even then, something else will still be required before he can open a workshop of his own. Skill alone will not be enough. Because somewhere beyond this doorway, another step waits, one that will ask him not only what he has learned, but who is willing to recognize that learning as belonging. By the time the boy in the workshop grows older, the tools begin to feel lighter in his hands, not because they have changed, but because repetition has shaped the way he lifts them. The hammer no longer surprises him with its weight. The bench no longer feels too high or too narrow. Even the smell of heated metal and oiled wood has become part of the air he expects each morning. Eventually, there comes a day when the master no longer watches every movement. That day does not arrive suddenly. It arrives the way roads appear in the distance, first as a faint line, then as something you realize you are already walking along. The apprentice becomes a journeyman. This does not mean he owns a workshop. It does not mean he chooses his own work. It means only that he is allowed to leave. In many medieval towns across Central Europe, France, and the Italian city-states, the years after apprenticeship formed a second stage of learning that required movement rather than stability. Journeymen traveled between towns carrying their tools, their experience, and often a letter from their former master explaining who they were and what they could do. Skill could be carried. Belonging could not. You walk beside one of these travelers now, along a narrow road leading toward a town he has never seen before. His toolkit is wrapped carefully in leather and tied with cord so that the edges of the tools do not strike against one another as he walks. The road beneath his feet is not unfamiliar in shape, but unfamiliar in meaning. He is no longer someone's apprentice. He's not yet someone's master. He belongs to the road between them. Journeymen often worked for wages rather than ownership. They entered workshops for weeks or months at a time, contributing their labor while continuing to learn new variations of their craft. Each town shaped tools slightly differently. Each workshop followed habits passed down through different families. Travel became another form of instruction. In some regions, journeymen carried written introductions signed by their former masters. These letters did not guarantee work, but they opened doors more easily than silence could. A workshop owner reading such a letter understood that the traveler standing in the doorway had already spent years learning the discipline required to remain inside a craft. Permission traveled on paper as often as it traveled in memory. The road grows narrower as the traveler approaches the edge of the town. Ahead, the gate stands open, though a guard watches those who pass beneath it with the calm attention of someone who has already seen many travelers arrive and depart in the same quiet way. Journeymen rarely arrived alone. They followed paths shaped by earlier journeys, stopping at towns known to welcome certain trades more readily than others. Networks of movement formed across regions long before maps recorded them clearly. A blacksmith might follow one road, a weaver another, a carpenter a third. But craft shaped geography as much as geography shaped craft. The traveler pauses briefly beneath the gate and removes the letter from his pouch before stepping forward. He smooths the folded edges with his thumb, not because the paper has changed, but because the act itself feels reassuring. A letter can steady a journey. Inside the town, streets curve differently from those he left behind. The houses are taller, the shutters open outward instead of inward. Even the rhythm of footsteps along the street sounds unfamiliar at first, as though the town itself speaks a slightly different language of movement. Journeymen learned to listen quickly. They entered workshops quietly, presented their letters, and waited while masters considered whether another pair of hands could be added to the work already in progress. Sometimes the answer came immediately. Sometimes it did not. Waiting became part of the journey. Guild ordinances in several medieval towns described how long a journeyman might remain in one place before moving again. These expectations ensured that knowledge continued to circulate rather than settling too quickly in a single workshop. Movement kept crafts flexible while still protecting their boundaries. Learning followed roads that never fully ended. The traveler reaches a doorway marked with a small wooden sign showing the symbol of the trade he has practiced since childhood. He pauses there for a moment before stepping inside, adjusting the strap of his toolkit in the same careful way he once adjusted his apprentice's apron years earlier. Inside, the workshop sounds different from the one he left behind, though the tools look familiar enough to recognize. He places the letter on the bench. The master unfolds it slowly. And for a moment, everything depends not on what the traveler can do, but on who is willing to recognize that he has already done it elsewhere. Journeymen could work in many towns, but opening a workshop of their own required something rarer than travel, rarer even than skill. It required acceptance from the craft itself. And somewhere ahead, beyond this doorway, that acceptance waits behind another test shaped not by roads but by hands working carefully toward a single object that must speak clearly enough to prove that the years of learning have truly taken root. There comes a moment in every long apprenticeship road when walking is no longer enough. Travel has carried you between towns. Work has filled your hands with experience. Letters have opened workshop doors that would otherwise remain closed. Yet even after all those years, there is still one threshold that cannot be crossed by movement alone. It waits inside the workshop itself. You enter before sunrise, when the streets are still quiet enough that the sound of your footsteps echoes against the shutters. Inside, the room smells faintly of wood shavings and oil. Tools lie arranged carefully along the bench, each one placed where it will be needed later in the day. Today, they will not be used for ordinary work. Today, they will be used for something that must speak for you. In many medieval cities, becoming a master craftsman required more than experience and more than travel. It required the creation of a single object known as a masterpiece. Why, this object was not intended for sale. It was intended for recognition. It demonstrated that the hands which shaped it could now be trusted to shape work independently. Trust was the final material of the craft. You set a small block of wood on the bench and adjust its position until the grain catches the light properly. Outside, the sky is only beginning to brighten. Inside, Two candles burn beside your tools, their flames steady enough that the shadows they cast remain predictable. Light becomes part of the work. Each movement of your hands changes how the surface reflects it. Each careful cut reveals a new line hidden beneath the outer layer. The object grows slowly, not because the work is difficult, but because it must be exact. Exactness is easier to see than to explain. In cities such as Florence and Paris, guild statutes described how masterpieces were presented to masters of the craft for examination. The object varied depending on the trade. A carpenter might construct a joint that fit so precisely it required no adjustment. A goldsmith might shape a small ornament whose balance revealed years of patient practice. A weaver might produce cloth whose pattern remained consistent from edge to edge. The form changed. The purpose remained the same. The masterpiece allowed the craft to decide whether a journeyman was ready to remain. Candles burn lower as the morning continues. Their light moves slowly across the surface of the object you are shaping, revealing details that would remain hidden in brighter daylight. For a while, the workshop contains only the sound of tools touching material in careful, measured rhythms. That no one interrupts this work. Everyone understands its meaning. In several guild traditions, the completed masterpiece was presented before a group of masters who examined it together. Sometimes they spoke openly about what they saw. Sometimes they remained silent while each person considered the object separately before reaching a decision. Silence itself became part of the evaluation. Silence allowed judgment to settle. You place the finished object on the bench and step back slightly, not because the work is complete, but because it must now belong to other eyes. The candles beside it continue burning, though their flames are shorter than they were before. Time has become visible in their height. Entry into the guild often required more than approval alone. Fees were sometimes expected, and these could be difficult to gather after years spent traveling from workshop to workshop. Tools had to be purchased, space had to be rented, materials had to be secured before a new master could begin working independently. Recognition opened the door. Resources allowed someone to walk through it. Guild ordinances preserved in city archives describe limits on how many workshops could operate within certain trades at one time. These limits ensured that work remained steady for those already inside the guild, but they also meant that admission depended not only on ability, but on timing. Even excellence waited its turn. The masters enter the workshop quietly, one after another, standing near the bench where the object rests between the candles. No one touches it at first. They look carefully, moving closer only when the light reveals something worth examining more closely. You watch without speaking. Watching is part of this moment too. Years earlier, you stood beside another bench polishing tools before sunrise. Now the tools stand beside you, waiting to learn whether they will remain in your hands or return to the road once more. The masters speak softly among themselves. Their voices do not carry far enough to be understood clearly. Instead, they move through the room like another kind of light, shifting the shape of the moment without revealing its conclusion too quickly. Finally, one of them nods, the others follow. The object remains where it is, but its meaning has changed. Acceptance into the guild does not end the craft. It begins a different relationship with it. The workshop that once belonged to someone else may soon become your own. The tools that once required permission may soon answer only to your decisions. And yet something else begins to grow at the same time. Because when many masters gather inside a city, their agreements begin to shape more than individual workshops. They begin to shape the streets themselves. And soon, the craft you have entered will stand not only as a place of work, but as a voice inside the government of the city that surrounds it. The bell begins before the street is fully awake. It does not ring loudly at first. It rises slowly, like a note drawn across a string, spreading outward from the tower above the square until it touches shutters, rooftops, and narrow alleys one after another. People do not stop what they are doing when they hear it. They adjust. That is what bells are for. You stand at the edge of the square as the sound continues, steady and measured, neither hurried nor uncertain. A baker pauses while lifting a tray. A cooper turns his barrel slightly toward the doorway before continuing his work. A merchant closes one ledger and opens another. Everyone understands what the bell means. The council is gathering. In many medieval cities across Europe, guilds did more than organize craftsmen. Over time, they began organizing the city itself. Representatives from major trades met regularly to discuss prices, supplies, disputes between workshops, and the movement of goods through markets that had grown too large to manage without shared agreement. Craft became conversation. Conversation became authority. You follow the sound of the bell toward the hall where the council meets. The doorway stands open, though the room inside remains quiet, except for the soft movement of chairs being arranged along a long wooden table. Several masters enter one by one, greeting one another with small nods rather than formal words. They have spoken together many times before. Meetings like this did not resemble assemblies of distant rulers. They resembled extended workshop discussions, only larger, slower, and more careful in their conclusions. Decisions made here shaped not only individual trades, but the rhythm of the streets outside. Price regulation often began with such conversations. If cloth was sold too cheaply, weavers could not maintain their work. If it was sold too dearly, buyers would turn elsewhere. Guild councils adjusted expectations gradually, seeking balance rather than advantage. Balance made markets predictable. Predictable markets made cities stable. Records from Florence describe how guild representatives helped guide decisions affecting taxes, public construction, and even the hiring of officials responsible for maintaining streets and bridges. Membership in a guild could therefore become a pathway into civic responsibility rather than remaining only a mark of technical skill. A workshop opened onto a council chamber more easily than you might expect. The bell sounds again outside, this time answered by another bell from a nearby tower. Together, they form a pattern that spreads across the district like overlapping voices in a piece of music, played slowly enough for each note to remain clear. Bells organized time as well as meetings. They announced the opening of markets. They signaled curfew at night. They called militia companies when danger approached. They marked festivals when streets filled with banners and processions that carried the colors of each craft through the city. Sound itself became a boundary that people learned to follow. You step back into the square as the council continues inside the hall. Along the far side of the street, several apprentices are fastening a painted banner to a pole that will be carried later in the day. The image on the cloth shows the symbol of their trade, stitched carefully in bright thread that catches the morning light as the fabric moves. Guild banners were not decorations alone, they were introductions. During civic festivals, each craft walked beneath its own colors through streets arranged into temporary corridors of music, conversation, and shared movement. Citizens watched from windows while processions passed slowly below, each banner marking a place within the structure of the city. Order could be seen as well as heard. In some towns, guild members also formed militia companies responsible for defending gates and walls during times of danger. These companies trained together in open squares, carrying equipment that looked familiar because it had been made in their own workshops. A city defended itself not only with stone, but with cooperation learned at workbenches. Workshops became watchposts in another form. Inside the council hall, voices rise slightly as the discussion turns toward the price of grain entering the market from nearby villages. Grain has always required attention. Too little of it unsettles a city. Too much of it unsettles those who grow it. Agreement requires patience. Guild councils did not always control every decision. Kings, bishops, and merchants traveling from distant regions also shaped the flow of goods through urban streets. Yet within the walls of many cities, guild authority formed the most immediate structure guiding daily life. A bell could open a meeting. A vote could close a market. A banner could identify a neighborhood. The city moved according to signals that people learned as naturally as they learned the sounds of their own workshops. You walk slowly across the square again as the council continues its work behind the doorway. Somewhere above you, the bell grows quiet at last, its final note settling gently into the morning air like the end of a long conversation. For now, the guilds speak clearly enough to shape the streets around them. But beyond the city walls, caravans are already moving along longer roads, carrying goods that do not recognize these bells, these banners, or these carefully measured agreements. And when those goods arrive, they will bring with them a different rhythm of trade, one that does not always stop when a council gathers or a bell begins to ring. The first sign of change does not arrive with noise. It arrives inside a bundle. You stand in a warehouse near the edge of the market quarter where goods from distant regions are unloaded before sunrise. The air smells of wool, dust, and damp wood. Crates rest in narrow rows along the wall, with their surfaces marked with symbols that few people in the city recognize yet. A merchant kneels beside one of them. He cuts the cord slowly, not because the knot is difficult, but because what lies inside is still unfamiliar. When the lid opens, folded cloth appears, smooth and tightly woven, dyed in colors slightly deeper than those produced in nearby workshops. He touches the fabric carefully, not to test its strength, to understand where it has come from. For many years, guilds shaped the rhythm of markets within city walls. They determined how cloth should be measured, how tools should be priced, how goods should move between workshops and stalls. Their rules formed a pattern strong enough that most people no longer noticed it. Markets followed the same streets every week. Buyers followed the same stalls every season. But long-distance trade began to follow different roads. Merchants traveling from Italy, the Baltic coast, and regions beyond the Alps carried goods that did not belong to local craft traditions. Their cloth was woven elsewhere. Their metal was shaped elsewhere. Their spices carried scents no workshop in the city could reproduce. Distance itself entered the marketplace. The merchant lifts a corner of the cloth and holds it toward the light coming through the narrow window above the warehouse door. The pattern remains even from edge to edge. No thread shifts out of place. No color fades where the fold has rested longest. He smiles slightly, though he does not speak. Foreign goods often arrived quietly at first. A single bundle, a single crate, a single cart passing through the gate without attracting much attention. Yet each arrival suggested that the market outside the city walls had begun to grow larger than the one inside them. Guild rules shaped neighborhoods, trade routes shaped continents. In several European kingdoms during the later medieval period, rulers granted special privileges to foreign merchants, allowing them to sell goods directly in cities where guild regulations would otherwise restrict entry. These privileges did not always remove guild authority, but they adjusted its edges. Edges are where change begins. Royal charters sometimes allowed merchants from distant towns to establish their own quarters within trading centers. These quarters followed different customs. They measured cloth differently. They weighed metals differently. They sometimes paid different duties than local craftsmen. Markets began speaking more than one language at once. Outside the warehouse, carts roll slowly toward the square where stalls are already being arranged for the morning. A porter lifts one of the new bundles and carries it across his shoulder with careful steps, as though he understands that the weight he carries includes more than cloth. It includes possibility. In Italian trading cities such as Florence and Venice, merchant companies extended their reach across seas and mountain passes, connecting workshops to distant buyers who never entered the streets where the goods were made. Letters traveled alongside cargo. Agreements traveled alongside letters. Trust followed routes that stretched farther than any guild council could easily supervise. Trade became something that moved even when cities stood still. The merchant closes the crate once more and ties the cord loosely around its lid. He does not need to hurry. There will be time later to display the cloth where buyers can see it. For now, he simply studies the marks burned into the wood along the crate's edge. Each mark represents a place the bundle has already passed. Each place represents a rule that did not exist here before. Municipal ordinances from cities across Northern Europe describe attempts by guilds to regulate foreign imports by limiting where they could be sold or how long they could remain inside the walls. Yet, enforcement became more difficult as trade networks expanded, roads multiplied, ports widened their reach, markets connected to one another across distances that no single council could easily oversee. Control followed the streets, trade followed the horizon. The porter returns from the square and lifts another bundle beside the merchant, setting it down with the same careful movement as before. This one carries spices rather than cloth. The scent rises immediately, warm and unfamiliar, spreading through the warehouse in a way that feels almost like a change in weather rather than a change in goods. New smells reshape expectations quickly. Buyers who once chose between local fabrics now compare them with materials carried across mountains. Craftsmen who once followed established measurements now adjust their work to match patterns arriving from elsewhere. Markets begin to move like water rising along a shoreline. At first, the change reaches only the edges. Then it spreads quietly across the entire harbor. Royal authority often followed this widening tide of trade, granting privileges that allowed merchants to bypass older guild restrictions when it suited broader economic goals. A ruler could strengthen a city by inviting new goods inside its walls, even if those goods unsettled local craftsmen for a time. Permission shifted again. This time, it shifted toward distance rather than neighborhood. You step outside the warehouse and watch the market square fill slowly with color as stalls open and banners rise above them. Somewhere nearby, a guild bell rings as it always has. Yet beneath that familiar sound, another rhythm has already begun to grow. It comes from ships far beyond the harbor, from caravans beyond the hills, from agreements written in places no one here has seen. And far to the southeast, in a palace courtyard where decisions move through corridors rather than markets, another kind of permission is already taking shape, one that will not regulate cloth or tools, but influence itself. Before the palace appears, the courtyard appears first. It opens quietly, without walls that feel defensive or towers that feel watchful. Instead, the space unfolds gradually beneath archways and trees, arranged with careful intention, as though the ground itself has been persuaded to grow in a particular pattern rather than forced to accept one. You walk across smooth stone still cool from the night air. Somewhere nearby, water moves through a narrow fountain channel, not loudly, but steadily enough that its sound remains present even when no one is speaking. Courtyards like this shape the rhythm of the palace long before anyone reaches the inner rooms. Movement begins here. Across the far side of the courtyard, a young attendant carries folded silk balanced carefully along both arms. The fabric shifts slightly as she walks, catching the early light in narrow lines that move with her steps. She does not hurry. No one hurries here without reason. Inside the imperial household, movement follows instruction more than impulse. Years earlier, before she crossed this courtyard for the first time, she lived far from these walls in lands known in Ottoman records as Ruthenia, a broad region of forests, rivers, and towns stretching across parts of Eastern Europe. From there, many young women entered the imperial household through systems that carried them southward into cities they had never seen before. Arrival meant beginning again. Names often changed at that moment. Within the palace, a renaming formed part of the transition from one life into another. A new name did not erase memory. It reshaped belonging. It marked entry into a household where identity followed different rules than those outside its walls. The young woman, who would later be known as Hürrem, entered the palace in this way, learning its routines gradually rather than all at once. Education inside the imperial household included language, etiquette, music, and the careful observation of how authority moved through corridors that rarely appeared crowded, yet never stood empty. Knowledge here traveled quietly. Topkapi Palace did not resemble a single building rising above the city. Instead, it formed a sequence of courtyards, chambers, and enclosed gardens, arranged so that movement from one space to another followed a path of increasing privacy. Each doorway marked a boundary, not of stone alone, but of permission. Permission shaped architecture. The attendant carrying silk passes beneath another archway leading toward a shaded corridor where several others wait beside a carved wooden screen. No one speaks loudly. Conversation inside the palace rarely needs volume. Messages travel through gesture as easily as through words. Learning how to move within these spaces required patience. The imperial household functioned as a structured community whose members followed clearly defined ranks. Senior women supervised younger attendants, trusted figures managed correspondence, others oversaw charitable foundations connected to the palace. Over time, experience determined how far a person might walk within its courtyards without being guided. Distance inside the palace was measured in trust. Ottoman court records describe how women within the imperial household received training not only in domestic tasks, but in literacy and communication as well. Letters written from within these rooms sometimes traveled far beyond the palace gates, carrying requests, gifts, and instructions that shaped relationships across the empire. Influence began with listening. The young attendant pauses beside the fountain channel for a moment before continuing across the courtyard. The water reflects the pale sky above her, breaking the reflection into small shifting pieces that move as she walks past. Courtyards like this were not decorative alone. They created spaces where movement slowed naturally, allowing observation to replace haste. Gardens within the palace served a similar purpose. Paths curved gently beneath trees planted in deliberate arrangements. Shade followed sunlight in patterns that encouraged reflection rather than urgency. Power often grows best where time moves slowly. Hürrem's presence within this environment did not become important immediately. Like many others entering the palace, she began by learning its rhythms before shaping them. She listened to conversations, she observed ceremonies, she followed instructions that explained not only where to walk, but when to remain still. Stillness can be a form of preparation. As seasons passed, the structure of the household became more familiar to her. Relationships formed gradually, not through sudden change, but through repeated contact across shared spaces. The palace encouraged this kind of learning by arranging its courtyards so that paths crossed often enough to allow recognition without forcing conversation. Recognition becomes influence when it continues long enough. Across the courtyard, the attendant reaches the doorway where others wait and hands the folded silk carefully to a senior figure who nods once before disappearing into the corridor beyond. The exchange lasts only a moment. Yet moments like this shape the daily movement of the palace as surely as walls shape its outline. Within these quiet routines, something else has already begun to change, because in time, the young woman who entered these courtyards without a name known to the empire will stand closer to the center of its decisions than anyone expected when she first crossed the marble floor beneath the morning light. And before long, the structure of the imperial household itself will shift in response to a marriage that few observers believed would ever take place inside these walls. At first, the corridors do not seem different. They carry the same quiet footsteps. The same filtered light falls across the same polished floors. Courtyard fountains continue their steady movement from one basin to another, as though nothing beyond the garden walls has changed at all. Yet, something has already begun to shift. It begins not with ceremony, but with attention. Inside the palace, attention moves like a small flame. It gathers slowly around certain conversations, certain doorways, certain figures who begin to appear more often at the center of daily movement than they once did. People notice this change before they speak about it, because attention rarely moves without reason. You walk along a shaded corridor where carved wooden screens soften the sunlight into narrow patterns across the floor. A messenger passes beside you carrying a folded letter sealed carefully with wax. He does not hurry, though the letter will travel far beyond these walls before the day is finished. Messages like this connect the palace to places that never appear on its maps. In earlier generations of the Ottoman court, imperial consorts did not usually become legal wives of the Sultan. Instead, the structure of the household encouraged distance between personal relationships and formal authority. This arrangement allowed succession to remain flexible, shaped by circumstance rather than fixed expectation. Flexibility kept the court balanced. But during the reign of Sultan Suleiman, something unusual occurred. He chose to marry Hürrem. The marriage did not happen suddenly. It emerged gradually from years of proximity, trust, and conversation within the palace itself. By the time it was recognized formally, the change it represented had already begun to reshape expectations among those who watched the structure of the imperial household carefully. Marriage altered position. Position altered influence. The messenger pauses at a doorway and waits while another attendant lifts the curtain separating one chamber from the corridor. Inside, voices speak softly in a language that carries both familiarity and distance at once. Letters moving through rooms like this often continued their journeys across seas and frontiers before reaching rulers who had never seen the palace where they began. Hürrem's correspondence with foreign courts later became one of the most visible signs of her role within imperial life. Letters addressed to rulers in Poland and Persia carried requests, assurances, and gestures of goodwill that extended her presence far beyond the courtyards where she first learned to walk carefully beneath the shade of the trees. Words traveled where footsteps could not. The marriage between Suleiman and Hürrem also changed expectations surrounding succession. In earlier centuries, imperial sons often grew up in separate provincial settings where experience in governance prepared them for future leadership. With Hürrem's sons remaining closer to the palace environment, patterns of inheritance began to follow different paths than before. Paths shape outcomes long before they are recognized. You step aside as the messenger continues forward, his letter now hidden beneath the fold of his sleeve. Around him, the corridor remains quiet, though its silence carries the weight of conversations that reach beyond the palace gates. Marriage within the imperial household did not resemble marriage in a village or city street. It reshaped relationships between families, advisors, officials, and provinces, connected to the court through layers of expectation that extended across the empire itself. A household could become a map. Records preserved in Ottoman chronicles describe how Hürrem's presence gradually influenced the structure of the court's inner arrangements. Her proximity to the Sultan allowed her to support charitable projects, correspond with diplomats, and participate in discussions that shaped decisions affecting regions she would never visit directly. Influence often grows where movement appears limited. In time, the marriage came to symbolize a broader transformation in the role of women within the imperial household. Later generations would remember this period as the beginning of what historians sometimes describe as an era when women of the palace exercised more visible authority in shaping political relationships across the empire. Authority can move quietly through corridors. The messenger reaches the end of the hallway and disappears through another doorway, leaving behind only the faint echo of his steps along the polished floor. Outside, the courtyard fountain continues its steady movement from one basin to another, unchanged in sound, though changed in meaning for those who listen more closely than before. Water repeats itself. Fire spreads. Attention settles where it is needed. Within these corridors, a marriage that few observers expected has already begun to alter how influence travels between chambers, provinces, and distant courts, connected by letters carried through hands like those of the messenger who passed beside you only moments ago. And beyond the palace walls, that influence will soon take visible form in buildings, kitchens, schools, and fountains that reshape entire neighborhoods without ever appearing to command them directly. The first thing you notice is the line. It forms quietly beside a courtyard wall where the evening air still holds the warmth of the day. People stand there without speaking loudly, each holding a small bowl or cloth-wrapped container. No one pushes forward. No one turns away. The line moves slowly, like water finding its level along the edge of a basin. At the far end of the courtyard, a cook lifts a ladle from a wide copper pot. Steam rises into the air and drifts toward the stone archway above the kitchen entrance. The smell is simple and familiar, closer to home than to ceremony. Grain, broth, and herbs prepared together in a way that does not belong to one household alone. This kitchen belongs to the city. In the 16th century, Hürrem Sultan supported the creation of charitable complexes that reshaped daily life in neighborhoods far beyond the palace courtyards where her influence began. These complexes often included mosques, schools, hospitals, fountains, and kitchens designed to serve travelers, students, and residents who passed through the district each day. Architecture became a form of care. You step closer as the cook fills another bowl and hands it to a waiting figure whose face disappears again into the line without ceremony. Public kitchens, such as this one, formed part of charitable foundations supported through permanent endowments that ensured food would continue to be prepared long after the moment of construction had passed. Endowments allowed buildings to keep working even when their founders were no longer present. In Ottoman cities, charitable foundations supported not only kitchens, but also fountains placed along streets where travelers and residents could draw water freely. These fountains stood at corners, beside mosques, and near markets where movement gathered naturally throughout the day. Water shaped neighborhoods as surely as roads did. You hear the steady sound of a fountain nearby before you see it. Its narrow stream falls into a shallow basin where several children wait with small cups balanced carefully between their hands. The water moves continuously, not quickly, but with enough certainty that no one doubts it will still be there tomorrow. Public water changes how people move through a city. In earlier villages, rivers and wells often belonged to those who controlled the surrounding land. Here, fountains placed within charitable complexes offered something different. They created shared spaces that welcomed strangers as easily as neighbors, shaping paths across the city that followed water rather than boundaries. Movement follows what is reliable. Records preserved from Hürrem Sultan's charitable foundations describe how revenues from markets, fields, and workshops were assigned permanently to support these institutions. The income ensured that teachers received salaries, kitchens received supplies, and hospitals received the materials needed to treat those who arrived at their doors. Charity required structure. You walk along a narrow street where a school attached to one of these complexes stands beside a courtyard shaded by trees planted carefully along the wall. Inside, students sit on low benches listening to a teacher whose voice carries just far enough to reach the doorway without entering the street beyond it. Learning travels quietly through spaces like this. Hospitals supported by similar foundations offered care to travelers and residents alike. Their rooms remained open to those who arrived without preparation, guided by attendants who understood how to move through corridors designed for both rest and treatment. Care became part of architecture. The cook at the kitchen lifts another ladle and pauses briefly to adjust the fire beneath the copper pot. Flames move gently between the stones, steady enough to keep the broth warm without drawing attention to themselves. The work continues with the same calm rhythm it has followed all evening. Routine makes generosity reliable. In Jerusalem, another charitable complex supported by Hürrem Sultan provided food, shelter, and water to travelers entering the city from distant regions. The buildings stood near routes already shaped by earlier generations of movement, extending those paths rather than replacing them. Charity followed roads already in use. Across these cities, foundations like these did more than provide assistance. They created places where daily movement gathered naturally, linking neighborhoods through shared access to food, water, and learning. A person walking from one district to another could follow fountains and kitchens the way travelers once followed rivers and bridges. Access became a landscape. You return to the courtyard where the line has grown shorter as evening deepens. The cook continues working with the same steady motion as before, lifting the ladle, filling each bowl, and setting it gently into waiting hands without needing to speak. No one asks where the food began. Everyone knows where it is going. Buildings like this did not command attention in the way palaces did. They shaped the city more quietly, adjusting how people moved, where they gathered, and how they understood belonging within neighborhoods connected by shared resources. Influence sometimes looks like a doorway that remains open. As the last bowls are filled and the courtyard begins to empty, the fountain continues its steady sound beside the kitchen wall, reminding anyone who passes that the city itself has begun to change shape in ways that follow water rather than walls. And through these quiet acts of giving, something larger has already taken form, a pattern in which access to food, learning, and movement begins to reveal how power can organize daily life without ever needing to announce itself aloud. There is a moment, usually near evening, when roads become easier to see. The light falls low across the ground, and paths that seemed ordinary during the day begin to show their edges more clearly. Stones stand out from dust. Wheel marks appear where carts passed earlier. Even footprints remain visible for a little while before the darkness settles across them again. You sit beside one of those roads now. It is not the first road you have followed. Long ago, you walked toward a village oven where bread was baked in a place chosen for you rather than by you. Later, you carried grain to a mill whose turning wheel gathered harvest from many households into a single doorway of permission. After you crossed rivers where ferrymen waited beside ropes stretched across the current. You walked roads where coins changed hands beside wooden posts that leaned quietly at the edge of the track. Each road looked ordinary at first. Each road asked something small. Across the hills of Judea, another road appeared beneath the feet of soldiers who built camps that repeated the same shape wherever they stopped. Their roads connected watchposts, settlements, and vineyards planted beside former camp boundaries until movement itself began to follow lines drawn long before anyone living nearby had chosen them. A road can remain after its builders disappear. In growing cities of medieval Europe, you entered workshops where learning followed years instead of seasons. Tools passed from one pair of hands to another. Letters opened doors between towns. Candles burned beside objects, shaped carefully enough to decide whether someone could remain inside the craft or return once more to the road outside it. Work became a doorway. Doorways became decisions. Within council halls, bells marked the hours when markets opened and closed. Banners moved through streets during festivals that arranged neighborhoods into visible patterns of belonging. Agreements spoken around wooden tables shaped the price of cloth, the rhythm of trade, and the safety of gates guarded at night by craftsmen who had learned to stand together as they once learned to work together. Cities learned to listen to bells. And far beyond those streets, inside courtyards where fountains moved water from basin to basin beneath shaded trees, another kind of authority took shape. Kitchens offered food to travelers who carried no coin. Schools opened doors beside mosques where learning followed quiet voices instead of distant roads. Hospitals welcomed strangers whose names were never recorded in the ledgers of markets, but whose presence shaped the movement of entire neighborhoods. Charity became architecture. Architecture became memory. You rise and continue walking along the road as evening settles slowly across the fields. The surface beneath your feet changes from packed earth to stone, then from stone to a narrow track between grasses that move gently in the last light of the day. Roads rarely end where they appear to end. They continue through habits. They continue through expectations. They continue through permissions that become so familiar they no longer feel like permissions at all. Across centuries, authority learned that controlling movement did not always require walls. It required crossings, it required workshops, it required kitchens, it required places where daily life gathered naturally, the way water gathers in low ground after rain. Control follows gathering places. You pause beside a fork where three paths meet. One leads toward a village where ovens stand near the hall of a lord who keeps count of bread as carefully as fields. Another leads toward hills once marked by Roman camps whose outlines still shape vineyards planted beside their roads. A third leads toward a city where fountains still carry water through courtyards built by hands that understood generosity as a form of permanence. Each road belongs to a different century. Each road asks the same question: who decides where you may go? The traveler resting beside you lifts a small bundle from the ground and adjusts the strap across his shoulder before choosing one of the paths without hesitation. He does not explain his choice. He does not need to. Choices follow patterns long before they follow reasons. Over time, ovens gathered villages, mills gathered harvest, roads gathered travelers, workshops gathered craftsmen, councils gathered cities, courtyards gathered influence. And through all these gatherings, something quiet took shape. Permission became the map beneath your feet. The stars appear above the horizon one at a time as the last light fades from the road behind you. They follow no council, no charter, no boundary drawn in ink or stone. Yet even they help travelers choose directions across landscapes shaped by decisions made long before those travelers began walking. You follow the road a little farther before stopping once more. Somewhere ahead, another village waits beside another crossing. Somewhere behind you, another courtyard still holds the sound of water moving steadily through its channels. And somewhere between those places, the past continues its quiet work, arranging the paths people follow without ever needing to speak about them aloud. And so, we've reached the end of tonight's wandering. Whether your eyes are still open or already drifting, Thank you for keeping me company here among worn stones, warm embers, and the small brave rituals of ordinary people. If this brought you a little quiet, you're welcome to subscribe or share it with someone who might need a softer night. For now, rest well. You're safe, you're warm, and the past can keep watch.